I think that's total nonsense. It's complete misreading of the genetic literature. The fact is, nobody's ever found a single gene that if you have it, you're going to have ADHD, and if you don't, you won't. Nobody's ever found a group of genes that if you have it, you're going to have ADHD, and if you don't, you won't. Things run in families, but something running in a family doesn't make it genetic.
Today, we're talking about attention deficit disorder, a diagnosis that's risen dramatically over the past few decades, with more children and adults being assessed than ever before, and long waiting lists for support, and growing concern with what modern childhood may be doing to young people. We're going to ask, is attention deficit disorder a medical condition? Is it a developmental response to stress? And what does the rise in diagnosis tell us about the world children are growing up in today? Dr. Maté, it's a real honor to have you on Family Talk, and thank you so much for joining us. Before we go into detail, can I just start with a really basic but perhaps most important question? What actually is attention deficit disorder? How do you characterize it?
Well, its medical definition hinges on a number of traits that are present over time in an individual, child or adult, and they have to do with poor impulse regulation, poor attention, tuning out, lack of concentration. In boys particularly, sometimes hyperactivity. And this is associated with a number of other issues and traits, but fundamentally, it's a collection of traits that are then called a disorder. The fundamental problem is that it's rather circular because it doesn't explain anything. For example, I myself was diagnosed with this condition in my early 50s. That's when I wrote my first book on this very subject. So let's just go through this. Gabor has ADHD. How do we know? He has poor concentration skills, he tunes out, he tends to be absent-minded, loses things, has poor impulse control, tends to be rather restless. Why is he like that? Because he's got ADHD. How do we know he's got ADHD? Because he tunes out, is absent-minded, has poor concentration skills, poor impulse regulation. Why does he have these traits? Because he's got ADHD. In other words, it's circular. So it's rather an assumption to say that these traits represent a specific medical entity. All they are is a description of certain patterns. And the question is why? And the diagnosis doesn't explain anything about the why.
Some people say that ADD, as we'll call it, is one of the most heritable conditions there is. Do you accept that?
I think that's total nonsense. It's complete misreading of the genetic literature. The fact is, nobody's ever found a single gene that if you have it, you're going to have ADHD, and if you don't, you won't. Nobody's ever found a group of genes that if you have it, you're going to have ADHD, and if you don't, you won't. Things run in families, but something running in a family doesn't make it genetic. I'm a medical doctor. If my children become medical doctors, it doesn't prove that the practice of medicine is a genetic disease. You know, traits are passed on in a number of ways. There is, no, I'm not going to go into, unless you want me to, the critique of the genetic hypothesis, but it's based on a misreading of the literature and on some false assumptions. And I do cover that in my book, Scattered Minds and ADHD. But there is something genetic, but it's not the disorder. What is genetic is the high degree of sensitivity. Some children are born more sensitive. Sensitive means they're more affected by the environment. Sensere, from the Latin word to feel. Now, how do we know that these kids tend to be more sensitive? They have more allergies. They have more eczema. They have more asthma. You know what we call those? Hypersensitivities. And that same sensitivity, now, when you're allergic to pollen, it means that one grain of pollen can trigger sneezing or a rash or an asthmatic episode. Somebody who's not sensitive, they can beat all the pollen they want and they'll never have that reaction. So it's not just the question of the pollen causing it, it's their sensitivity. And what I'm saying is that these people with ADHD or diagnosed that are born hypersensitive, that means they're much more affected by the environment. And the real issue is, what is the environment, not what the genes are.
You often hear about the genes sort of loads the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. Is it that sort of combination, do you think, that can manifest in this collection of symptoms?
Well, let's take tuning out, which is sort of the major symptom, the absent-mindedness. What is that? Not a disease. It's actually a coping mechanism. If I were to stress you right now, you'd have a number of options. You could fight back and tell me to back off, or you could hang up on me. Fight or flight. But what if you couldn't? What if I was generating stress and you couldn't extricate yourself? You know what you tune out? You wouldn't do anything. Your brain would kind of shut down and tune out to protect you from the stress. What I'm suggesting is that in today's highly stressed society, when families are under tremendous stress, parents are under tremendous stress, women are under tremendous stress, these sensitive kids cope with it by tuning out, which then gets wired into their brain. And if we're going to talk about ADHD as a developmental disorder, why don't we look at how the brain actually develops? And very few people who talk about ADD actually look at brain development. Do you know how the brain actually develops? If you look at the brain science, it develops under the impact of the environment. And so I could quote you from an article from Harvard University 15 years ago that said that the brain develops through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile environment, a foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. So first of all, it begins before birth. You know what that means? That means that when women are stressed during pregnancy, through no fault of their own, economic conditions, social conditions, political instability, relational issues, unresolved trauma, whatever it is, that stress during pregnancy is already affecting the baby's brain. And we know that women who are stressed during pregnancy are more likely to have kids with ADHD and other issues later on. That's the first point. The second point is, from the same article, Harvard University on brain development, that the circuits of the brain develop through an ongoing process that involves the environment interacting on the genes. And the most important aspect of the environment, according to all the brain developmental research of the last 50 years, is the emotional environment in which the child grows up. So when the parents are stressed, the child is stressed. It's that simple.
So we have a serious problem in this country with maternity services, and we have a lot of inquiries into maternal death. How far do you believe that the impact on the infant, this would impact the infant and the developing child when we have even our maternity services are under crisis with poor care and women not being listened to?
Well, see, that's the whole point. First of all, if something is genetic, why is it increasing? Genes don't change in a population over 10, 15, 20, or 30 years. Something else is changing. And what's changing is a stress level on women and families. Now, first of all, yes, what you say about poor services and so on is a huge impact on the stress level of families, and therefore on parents' capacity to be calmly present for their kids. Number one. Number two, human beings were not evolved to live in nuclear isolated families. We evolved in clans and extended families, living out in nature, where children were spent the whole day, their whole lives around nurturing adults. So in today's society, those conditions are long gone. And we have these isolated families under tremendous stress, pregnant women isolated under tremendous stress, new mothers isolated under tremendous stress. Of course, we're going to see more troubled kids because their brains are being affected by those adverse conditions. And lest anybody think I'm blaming parents, I'm not. This is a social, political, economic issue. It's a cultural issue. It's not bad parents. It's a question of parents under so much stress that they're not able to meet the emotional needs of their kids.
I mean, no baby is born with impulse control or the ability to focus attention.
No.
But do you feel that what we call attention deficit disorder is development that has been shaped or impaired by those kind of experiences? Do you believe there's anything that the child is simply born with?
As you say, no child is born with any impulse regulation. None. No child is born with emotional self-regulation. No child is born with any attentional capacities whatsoever. Those have to develop. Now, if anything is a developmental issue, what do you have to ask? If you were a gardener or a horticulturalist, developing plants in your backyard or in your field, what would you have to ask yourself to bring these plants to full development? You'd have to yourself, well, what conditions are needed? Irrigation, sunlight, minerals in the soil. It's the same with kids. And so the questions we have to be asking ourselves is, what are the conditions required for human children or mammalian children in general, dogs, horses, or any young infant creature to develop into their full potential? You need the right conditions. And human children have certain needs that if they're met, they will develop, and if they're not, they won't. So again, what we're talking about here is a culture that fails our children. And that's why we're seeing more of these, not just, by the way, ADHD. Anxiety amongst kids is rising, self-cutting is rising, eating disorders are rising, depression is rising, so that addictive behaviors are rising, so that what we're seeing here is these responses to what in my most recent book, The Myth of Normal, the subtitle is Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. We're living in a toxic culture now that affects children by affecting the capacity of parents to be fully present for those kids. That's what's going on.
I mean, it brings me to another point, which is many people have argued that we have an increase in diagnoses because it's more recognized. And other people have said, pupils, teachers, and clinicians have said that we're seeing more cases because some people are doing online questionnaires, some people are gaming the system so that they can get extra time in exams. Yeah. How far do you think that the increase in diagnosis is to do with overdiagnosis or misdiagnosis?
I think those are valid points, but they don't cover the whole picture. In the United States, there was a poll, I think a year or two ago. 25% of adults in this poll identified themselves as having ADHD. 25%, which is an impossible number. And I'm sure what they're doing is they're reacting to internet information and they're recognizing in themselves some of the traits, So I think that plays into it. I also think that we're more alert to the diagnosis, so we're diagnosing more people. But I think anybody who's been in education or medicine or psychology for decades will tell you that even those are plausible contributors to the rise in diagnosis. We're genuinely seeing more young people or adults with these traits, quite regard from any diagnostic bias. So yes, those are contributing factors, but they don't account for the vast numbers that we're seeing now. I think we're genuinely seeing more human beings distressed in all kinds of ways.
I mean, it takes me to your own experience. You mentioned earlier that you were diagnosed in your 50s. You were born into a Jewish family in Nazi-occupied Hungary, surrounded by fear and loss and uncertainty. And you've spoken about how those earliest experiences shaped the way you came to understand trauma. Can you talk a little bit more about that and its impact?
Yeah. So in my book, Scattered Minds, I describe the circumstances of my first year or so of life. And so I was born January 44 in Budapest. In March, the Nazis marched into Hungary. And I'll tell the story just to indicate how sensitive babies are to their mother's emotional states. The Germans occupied Hungary, I think it was March the 16th or 17th, 1944. The next day, my mother phoned the pediatrician to say, would you please come and see Gabor? Of course, he's crying all the time. And the doctor said, yes, I'll of course see him, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying. Now, as an infant, what do I know about Nazis or impending genocide or Second World War? Nothing. What am I picking up on? The emotional states of my mother. And that was the first year of my life. You can imagine her emotional state, given that her husband, my father's away in forced labor, she doesn't know if he's dead or alive. My grandparents, her parents, are killed in Auschwitz when I'm 5 months of age. We ourselves are in danger of deportation. Hunger, illness, I could go on. Of course I tune out, and of course my circuits don't develop, and of course I develop a certain resistance to being present in the world. Now, that's my experience. It doesn't take that much of a dire situation. However, kids are highly sensitive, especially the highly sensitive kids are highly sensitive. So in general, my parents are stressed, as I said earlier, because of economic or social conditions, political uncertainty, isolation, multi-generational unresolved trauma, relational issues between the parents. Kids pick up on that. And let me tell you something. For example, if you want to know if a marriage is in trouble, you can do two things. You can ask the parents, or you can measure the stress hormone levels of the child.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, there's all this evidence on the, we also know, for example, and this we've known this for decades, and what always astonished me is how much knowledge is, even though it's scientifically not controversial, is missing from the education of physicians. But let me tell you an astonishing fact, or not so astonishing. Multiple studies have shown over the decades that the more stressed parents are, the more likely the child is to have asthma. Now, kids with ADHD are highly prone to asthma. Now, I could tell you the physiology of it is very straightforward, but the point is children's physiological states, and as I said earlier, the development of the brain circuits is very much under the influence of the emotional environment. So that psychology translates into physiology, which then creates more psychology. So we have a circular interaction, which is my whole point in writing Scattered Minds is, let's change the environment of these kids. They're going to change. In other words, rather than assuming that they have this genetically determined, written in stone disorder, which is scientific nonsense, let's just recognize that they're very responsive to the environment. And if we create a different environment for them, they'll develop along healthy lines, as can adults. So that's the whole point, is let's not doom people with this genetic sentence of you got this condition written in your DNA. No, you don't. You have a high degree of sensitivity, which means that if we change the environment for the better, you're going to respond in positive ways. That's the whole point. That means in the home, in the schools, in the kindergarten, in the daycares, everywhere.
People might argue that you get children in the same family with the same stresses. One will be fine, the other one will display all these particular symptoms. How do you explain that?
It's so straightforward. It's like falling off a chair. No children are born to the same family. No children have the same parents. First of all, there's a birth order. The first child does not have the same experience as the second child. Number one. Number two, the parents might be in a different state of their lives, different stage of their lives with one child and another. So they're not exactly the same people. Number three, each child evokes a different response from the parent. So, I'm not saying that parents favor or love one child more than the other, but they don't react the same way to them. Number three, each child is born with their own temperament. So as I think it was the British child psychologist, the child psychiatrist, Winnicott said that even if a mother could be the same mother to all 8 of her children, which she couldn't be, they will still experience 8 different mothers because they have a different temperament. So there's all kinds of reasons. No 2 children are brought up in the same environment. No 2 children have the same parents. No 2 children have the same childhood.
The work of Jonathan Haidt, as you probably know about, has looked at the impact of smartphones and this fast, overstimulated environment that we're now in. And maybe that could explain the anxiety, the depression, and many of the things. I mean, he sees a sort of sharp starting point for many of the mental health disorders rising at about 2010 when the smartphone became much more in use. Where do you sit with that? I mean, you're looking at early childhood, but actually there's many other things going on that sort of muddy the waters.
There's a lot of truth in that, but he misses something. First of all, it's absolutely true. And there have been brain studies on kids that the more screens they watch, that affects their brain development in negative ways, including empathy, emotional intelligence, and so on. So those screens and those digital devices are actually damaging the kids' brains. And Haidt is absolutely right about that. And there's all kinds of evidence for that. In fact, they're designed to be addictive. And they engage the same circuits in the brain that addiction, which is another area of interest of mine, also engage. But here's what Haidt misses. That these devices are a substitute for something. You know what they're a substitute for? Contact with healthy, nurturing adults. Kids turn to these devices to entertain themselves, to keep themselves company, to find other kids to connect with, because they've lost their attachment relationship with the nurturing adults. That, again, is a cultural issue. So, yes, the cell phone, the digital media has a terrible influence on children, but it's in a context of loosened relationship with the nurturing adults. And so there's another book of mine. I mean, I know it sounds self-serving, but I'm mentioning my own books because it's
read by millions and helping millions, so go ahead.
Yeah. So the other book is called Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers. And those children that remain in a healthy attachment relationship with their parents can influence and regulate how much screen time the kids use. So their very loss of parental influence is reflected in the overuse by children of the screens. So the fundamental issue is not the screens, although I'd keep it out of kids' hands for many, many years. But the lost or loosened or fractured relationship with the adult world.
You mentioned in Scattered, as it's called, or Scattered Minds. It's also called Scattered Minds. You did two titles, isn't there? But Scattered Minds, you mentioned that on average we're working, or parents are working on average a month extra every single year. So that's why they are not so focused on children and they're busy. But how do we avoid that with economic stress? We have cost of living crisis in Britain and elsewhere. There's problems around the world with all sorts of, cost inflationary pressures. How can we avoid that? It would be ideal to have extended families and to not have to put children in nursery care. How do you think you can help people navigate that?
Yeah, I think there are two issues here. One is a social, political, economic one. It's a question of social priorities. If society actually recognized the needs of children, we would have totally different set of social policies. And that's beyond the power of individual parents. That's really is a social, political, economic question, a cultural question. And the fact is, this society does not value children. Not if you actually look at resources and understanding and energy. So that's a social question. On the individual level, however, here's what I'm saying. That, again, I repeat my earlier point. Human beings evolved for millions of years. Humanoids have been on hominids have been on Earth for millions of years. Our own species, Homo sapiens, have been here for close to 200,000 years. All those eons of evolution, throughout all those eons of evolution, until a very short time ago, children spent their whole time with the adults, in the company of adults, nurtured by adults, supervised by adults, taught by adults, nurtured by adults. So now we have a society that's completely torn asunder the evolutionally determined family attachments. You have to be aware of it, and we have to replace that attachment. So if parents are going to be away from their kids the whole day, they have to work extra hard at the end of the day to connect with their kids again. In the daycares, it should not just be an issue of physical care and behavior control, but those daycare workers need to be trained in attachment relationships so they provide healthy adult attachments for those kids. The average teacher, the average daycare worker, the average kindergarten caregiver doesn't get a single lecture on attachment, let alone on trauma. So that we need to become much more attachment aware. If we are, we can compensate as best we can for the loss of attachments, but we're not. So when you haven't seen your kids your whole day and the kid is 2 years old, don't assume that you're still their parent. You have to kind of bring them back into a relationship with you and spend more time relating and just being rather than just physically taking care of. So what I'm saying is we have to centralize attachment again. And by the way, why should I be telling this to a British audience? The great work on attachment was done in Britain by John Bowlby in the 1940s and 50s and beyond. And he's the great pioneer of attachment. Just listen to Bowlby, for God's sakes. Listen to Winnicott, another great British figure, so that we have this knowledge, but we don't transmit that knowledge to teachers, to physicians, to psychologists, let alone to parents, kindergarten workers, and so on. And one more thing. Adults who work with children tend to be the poorest paid in many ways. Yet they're doing the most important work. We should value these people, train them, cherish them, and compensate them. That's a social issue. That's not the fault of individual parents. But then we wonder, why are these so many kids in trouble? Because we're not meeting their needs, that's why.
I mean, you mentioned putting children in schools and daycare, but when you get to actual school level, their children are spending 4 or 5 or 6 hours a day sitting in classrooms, concentrating, being assessed. We have a results-driven system in the UK now. They're working towards exams. And is it surprising that so many struggle to focus in that kind of environment. Could some of these symptoms that you describe be to do with our exam-led academic system?
First of all, no child is meant to sit there for all that time. Again, if you look at human evolution, how did we evolve? Running around, playing, and we learned through play. Actually, play is much more important, by the way, for healthy brain development, according to brain science, than academic learning. Children who play will learn really well. But the schools emphasize achievement in order to fit kids into an industrial capitalist system where they'll be willing or at least acquiescent employees. But that's got nothing to do with the needs of the child. Those children need to be active, moving around, playing a lot. Number one. Number two, there's such a thing as evaluation stress. This has been studied in adults. Basically, if you're going to be evaluated, you're stressed and you don't think this clearly. So the very thing that's designed to measure your brain capacity undermines it. So these standardized tests and so on, total nonsense from the point of view of healthy child development. But try and tell a school board that, because they're trying to show results and grade scores and all that. That has nothing to do with the needs of the child.
I was going to ask, so how much of the behavior of an attention deficit disordered child is down to a mismatch between the way they should be behaving and the cultural sort of reasons and the way they're expected to learn?
That's significant in many cases. And sometimes when people say they grow out of ADHD, they didn't go out of ADHD, they go out of school, where they didn't have that same demands and expectations and limitations and restrictions on them anymore. Having said that, it's not just that, because I can tell you in my case, I have these traits. I lose things. I have trouble. I can have trouble focusing, especially if I'm not motivated. I can be very disorganized. You should see my desk.
Does it bother you anymore?
Sorry?
Does it bother you anymore?
Oh yeah, this is the cost of being me. Okay, so what? It's not like nobody ever dies of losing a book, So it's also a matter of self-acceptance, People with ADHD tend to go up with a deep shame about themselves, for which there's all kinds of reasons. The shame is unmerited, undeserved, and certainly not helpful. So part of the healing, as far as I'm concerned, is how about accepting yourself? Okay, you're going to lose stuff. Okay, you ask for direction in the street, and half the time, or more than half the time, if you're me, you're going to go the wrong direction. That's the cost of being Gabor. So what? In other words, drop the shame and drop the idea that there's something fundamentally wrong with you. And what I'm saying is that actually the way you are in many ways are normal responses to an abnormal environment.
Where does that shame come from?
Well, shame is a deep question. It has a superficial source and a deeper source. When I say superficial, I don't mean superficial, I mean surface. Look, when you have ADHD, you don't quite fit in. And you always get this sense that you don't quite fit in. Somebody I know who said that with ADHD it's like everybody's skating along and you're wearing sandpaper on your shoes. And then there's always this sense that you got your nose pressed against the glass but you can't quite enter, because you're different. And people in this society who are different are made to feel there's something wrong with them. That's the surface. It's not that it's not important, but there's a deeper one, which is where children are not attuned with, they're not seen, they think there's something wrong with them. So when the parents are stressed and the child is highly sensitive and the child is picking on the parent's stresses, the child takes that personally. They think there's something wrong with them. Not that the parents ever intend for the child to feel that, but the more sensitive you are, the more you're going to have that sense that there's something wrong with you. And by the way, kids, this is difficult to convey perhaps, but kids tend to take responsibility for their parents' emotions unconsciously. So if the parents are unhappy, the child tends to think there's something wrong with me because if I was better, they would be happy. So wherever there is stress, there's pressure, strain, unresolved trauma, kids tend to think there's something wrong with them, even though no adult means for them to believe that. But that's just how kids work.
I want to move on to the prescribing data. So we have a huge amount more children being, waiting for diagnosis, also being given medication. And I know you have used medication. And we now have, I think it's doubled or trebled the number of children who are being given drugs. And children, I think you mentioned in Scattered Minds, as young as 2, being given antipsychotics. Where do you sit with that? Do you think we're medicalizing or pathologizing a problem that is actually based on, which could be resolved else in another way?
Well, I have taken medication myself. In fact, when I wrote Scattered Minds, I took medication. It helped me focus. I wrote that book 27 years ago now. It seems to be the world's best-selling book on ADHD. Published all over the world. I stand by it, but I couldn't have done it without medication at that time. When I wrote my most recent book, The Metanormal, which is much bigger, more complicated, complex, much more research, took much longer to write, I took no medication. I didn't need it. In other words, the brain can develop new circuits in response to new circumstances. So the goal should not be just symptom control, but long-term development. And the medications don't help anybody develop anything. At the very best, they regulate symptoms, number one. So that should never be the only answer, and rarely should they be the first answer. Number one. Number two, the long-term research on the medications indicate that they don't change very much in the long term. They just don't. That's the sad truth. They've been heavily pushed by the drug companies, of course. They can help some people regulate symptoms in the short term, yes. So if somebody needs to concentrate to study in school or for an exam, I got nothing against it. But no child should get the message that they're not acceptable to the adults unless they're medicated. That's a terrible message to do up to a child. It's up to the adult world to find solutions, to make accommodations, to make space, to understand the child, to relate to the child in a way that the child can feel comfortable. We can do that. I guarantee you that child will need less medication. And I've seen that over and over and over and over again. So medications are rather a simplistic and I think sometimes crude way of dealing with the problem. As helpful as they can be, precisely because we don't understand child development, precisely because we don't understand the child's psychology, precisely because we don't understand attachment, precisely because we don't understand the role of stress in kids' lives, we resort to the easiest solution. Like if I'm a physician, I'm retired now from medical work, but if you come to me with a kid with ADHD and it takes me 1 minute to write a prescription for methylphenidate or dextridine or whatever, to talk to you about the family environment, to talk to you about how the parents can work on their own relationship to ease the family stresses, to make the child feel more comfortable, to talk to you about how to understand the child's behaviors, their reactivity, their impulse regulation issues, and how to respond to them compassionately and expertly. But that takes time. And in this society, it's so much easier to write a script than to pay attention to all these fundamental issues. That's the problem.
I don't know if you've seen the Cochrane reviews, so the gold standard review of ADHD medication shows that the longer term outcomes, the 3 years and beyond, may show that there's no difference in outcomes academically or in terms of ability to achieve things in work or otherwise. But why do you think, is there a point at which you think that this child needs medicating? And how does one decide? And how does one decide how long for? And what do you worry about the effects? Why not, if you like? If we've got to fit these children into school, why not do it?
Well, so first of all, the medications can have side effects. All medications. If you take an aspirin, it can have side effects. Some people get pain relief, and other people get a bleed in their stomach from aspirin. So we have to be very judicious about the use of medications. And number one. Number two, as I said, no child should be forced into it. So if I had a 9-year-old who's had difficulty concentrating in school, I would talk to them, having paid attention to all these other factors that I've been mentioning. Say, listen, kid, you have difficulty concentrating in school, is that right? Yes, I do. Well, if there was a medication that you could take that helped you focus and pay better attention in class, and if that medication didn't bother you, would you want to take it? Would you want to try it? Kid says yes. Okay, let's give it a try. Kid says no. End of conversation. If the kid says yes, then I'd say, well, let's try the really low dose. And if it helps you, good. If it doesn't help you, we can increase the dose. But I want to know every day how you're feeling. Because, for example, the Ritalin, the methylphenidate, it can calm kids down and make them sit there in the classroom and feel like absolute zombies. And their eternal experience is that of a kind of deadness. I want to know how you feel. So in other words, the medications, if they're to be used, they need to be used in real consultation with whoever's going to take that medication. And nobody should be forced to take it. Now, when it comes to antipsychotics, we know the effects of antipsychotics on adults, metabolic conditions, heart disease, and so on. And we give them to kids. It's a vast experiment in the chemical control of children's brains. Why? Because we're bereft of developmental knowledge. It's actually the use of medications in kids, for the most part, is a marker of the absolute illiteracy, emotional literacy of our society.
When you say that it's an experiment, do you mean that we don't know the long-term effects? Given that it's been used for so long, surely we can look at this data and that data and say, well, it's perfectly safe, and all these children were absolutely fine and came off it fine. We had a few that had side effects. Or do you mean it's an experiment for every individual child?
Well, wait a minute. That's true about the stimulants. It's not true about the antipsychotics. Here in Vancouver, British Columbia, where I live, at the Children's Hospital, they had to establish a special clinic for the side effects of the antipsychotics on kids.
Really?
Yeah, and it's, the metabolic consequences can be significant. And number one, as they are in adults. Number one. Number two, when I say it's an experiment, how long have we been using them in kids? Not that long. Do we know what the effects are going to be 40 years from now? When somebody who at age 5 was given antipsychotics, do we know what the effects are going to be at age 45? We don't. It's an experiment. So,
you don't feel the same about the Ritalin and the other drugs used to help people?
Well, again, we have to differentiate. I'm talking about the antipsychotics.
Yes. That's what I'm trying to do the same.
Yeah. The stimulants, they have been shown to sometimes inhibit growth in kids. That's been shown in studies. As you pointed out from that Cochrane review, they have not been shown to improve academic performance over a long period of time. So at the very best, they're short-term solutions. But I'm not so worried about the long-term effects. Of course, they can be highly addictive. So we have to watch that. And there's a significant increase in the United States in a number of emergency room visits due to stimulant abuse.
Wow.
So we have to...
Is it more dependence forming, or is there a difference?
Difference between, sorry?
Being addictive or dependence forming. Are people dependent on it, or are they addicted to it?
Well, that's a crucial distinction. I define addiction, and I worked with the Western world's most concentrated population of drug users here in Vancouver, British Columbia. By the way, I don't know if you saw, but there was a jury decision yesterday in the United States where they found Meta guilty of promoting addiction to Meta amongst kids. No, I define addiction as any behavior in which a person finds temporary relief or pleasure and therefore craves, and then suffers negative consequences and can't give it up. That's an addiction. A dependence is something different. A dependent means that you don't necessarily crave it, but when you come off it, you suffer withdrawal symptoms. So, for example, a lot of people who are prescribed antidepressants, it's not an addiction, but they don't crave, but they do develop a dependence in that when they come off, they have serious withdrawal symptoms. And so all medications have to be handled very respectfully. But no, a dependence is not exactly, all addictions involve dependence, but not every dependence is an addiction. Let me put it that way.
Do you think that the growth in ADD diagnosis is partly down to the expansion of this medical and pharmaceutical model? Do you think that drug companies push the idea that this is a condition that needs to be treated?
I'm sorry, it's not what I think. It's a question what the record shows. And the record shows that they went to a lot of trouble to pay doctors big bucks to push the medications. It's a scandal. That's not much paid attention to, but it's been documented. So it's not a matter of what I think. But more in general, quite apart from the chicanery of the pharmaceutical companies, and we've seen that in so many areas, the opioid use and so on, the biggest drug pushers in the world are the pharmaceutical companies. The difference is that when they push drugs that kill people, they get rewarded with high profits. And when one of my addicted clients in the downtown east side of Vancouver sold an ounce of heroin, they'd be put in jail. That's the only difference. But you know what? My ADD brain just forgot what question you asked. What did you ask?
Well, so I was wondering whether the rise in ADD diagnosis was could be partly blamed on this medical and pharmaceutical model of it that's pushing this. Yeah.
In part, yes, but there's a broader issue, which is the medical ideology. And I write about that in a number of my books. The medical, do you know something? The average physician in Britain or Canada or United States doesn't get a single lecture on health. They all get lectures on pathology. So we tend to look at all life through the lens of pathology. And there's this biological determinism, whereas we say that like mental health in general, these are diseases of the brain. Well, first of all, there's no proof for that. Number one. Number two, as I said earlier, and this is a point that's also not taught in the medical schools. I quoted you from that Harvard article on brain development, how the brain develops an interaction with the environment, and the circuits of the brain, the chemistry of the brain, depends on environmental input. Nobody teaches that to medical students. So that even if we're looking at the biology of the adult brain, we're looking at the impact of the environment. But we reduce everything down to the biology. So you have this biological determinism and what we call biological psychiatry. Now, there was an American psychiatrist and internal medicine specialist in 1977. We're talking 50 years ago now, who said that human beings are biopsychosocial creatures, which means that the biology of human beings is inseparable from their emotional and psychological life and their social relationships. So when we look at health or the absence of it, we have to look at not just the biology, but at the psychology and social relationships that also influence the biology. Medical students are not taught to do that. We reduce everything to biology, and therefore the pharmaceuticals seem like the answer. Why? Because we're not looking at the broader picture. And that's not just the venality of the pharmaceutical companies, which, by the way, is infinite, but it's also the Western ideology.
Do you think that the child who develops attention deficit disorder, do you think that there's something about that label itself that is negative and impactful? It's got the word deficit and disorder in it. Should we rethink that?
Yeah. It can work both ways, you know? Interesting question. When I was diagnosed, first self-diagnosed, and then I saw a psychiatrist who threw holy water on my self-diagnosis, I was pleased. I thought, okay, now I get it. There's some reason for all this. With a child, it can work both ways. If we recognize that this child is exhibiting certain traits, and those traits reflect the child's relationship with the environment, so let's change the environment in positive ways to help that child develop along more solitary lines. That's a good thing. But that's not the only thing. That's not what tends to happen most of the time. What tends to happen is we label the child, and that label follows the kid wherever they go. And then everybody treats them as if they were that disorder. Nobody's a disorder. People may exhibit certain traits, and if we can work with those traits in a positive way, that can change. But unfortunately, too often it's, as you say, it becomes a label that then stamps the child, and everybody looks at them through that lens, and they don't see the real person.
The idea that we have in Britain, I'm sure you've heard it, the sort of just snap out of it, stiff upper lip. Back in my day, we had all sorts of issues. We just didn't talk about it. What do you think the impact of that is? And a lot of parents kind of will be thinking like that. You've mentioned a connection between suppressing your true self and your feelings and autoimmune diseases and other diseases. Do you believe that snapping out of things and stiff upper lip is actually not the way to go? Or do you think there is an element that we are overthinking our neuroses in a way, if you like?
Was it St. Paul or somebody else who said that by their fruits you shall know them? What are the fruits of that stiff upper lip stuff? What we see today, not dealing with those issues, is precisely what got us to where we are today. I mean, every generation reflects the experience of that younger generation with the older generation. The British stiff upper lip has resulted in all kinds of repression with all kinds of negative consequences. The British stiff upper lip is a colonial appendage, if you like. Because when you have a stiff upper lip, you can go to India and kill the natives and not even feel a twinge in your heart. So I don't recommend it. And just actually try it. I mean, this metaphor of the stiff upper lip, when you have an emotion, whether it's sadness or grief or joy, those aren't just ideas in your head. That's a physiological process in your body. Now try to keep a stiff upper lip in the middle of that. what will that cost you? It'll cost you any connection to your true self. So, and you know, the British upper class that devastated the world. I just finished reading Dorothy Roy's great autobiography, Mother Mary Comes to Me, and the impact of colonialism in India. How were they treated? How were those people treated? They went to so-called public schools, which are, you know, I don't understand that word public school because they were private schools. But anyway, where they were beaten and abused, and they had to keep a stiff upper lip. And then what did they do in the rest of the world? So don't talk to me about stiff upper lips.
You talk. We'll have many people watching today who have real problems. We have a pandemic of mental ill health, I'll say. We've had children who are addicted to phones, they're gaming, and you've talked a lot about counterwill and this difficult behavior that can't be controlled. When a child reaches a certain age and a certain level of misbehavior, if you like, how do parents deal with that? I mean, we've talked about the problems with medication, but what does one do? Especially traumatized children, and many foster carers will have perhaps taken on board a previously likely traumatized child.
Well, foster parents, bless their souls, take on a very arduous duty, which is to deal with the trauma that the child incurred long before they came to that foster care. And then they're expected to be good parents to these really challenging kids. So first of all, let's take our hats off to the foster parents and recognize what they've taken on. Number one. Number two, they have to understand that the child's behaviors are not deliberate. You know, we have this phrase acting out. Do you have the phrase acting out in England?
Yes, we do.
Okay, now when I say a kid is acting out, what do you say the child is doing at that moment? Like, what are you talking about?
Well, they're acting out, they're behaving in a way which is, as we would see it, difficult and being resistant to what you're telling them to do.
Yeah, well, that's not what acting out means.
No.
When you act out, you're portraying in behavior something you haven't got the words to say in language. That's what acting out means. In a game of charades where you're not allowed to speak, what do you have to do? You have to act it out. So, are we going to respond to the behavior only, or we're going to try to understand the emotional dynamics that the child is portraying because they don't have the language to speak it in words? So the question is, do we understand the child's behavior? That doesn't mean we tolerate or accept or encourage damaging, hostile behavior. I'm not talking about permissiveness. I'm talking about understanding. Believe me, when you understand, like oppositionality, for example, you call kids oppositional. You know what nonsense that is? Because oppositionality, by definition, happens in a relationship. I say this in my public talks. I say to the audience, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go into a room tonight when you're all by yourself, make sure you're alone, and oppose somebody. And show me how you do it. Oppositionality, by definition, implies a relationship. Why are we diagnosing the child? Why don't we look at the relationship of that child to the adult world? So what I'm saying is, if we understand, which is what my books are intended to do, in this case on children, both Scattered Minds and Hold On to Your Kids, are intended to help adults understand the child's behavior so that we respond not as a intrinsic recalcitrant trait of the child, but as a response to the environment. When we change the environment, guess what? The child changes. So foster parents need a lot more support in understanding the psychology of the child and in helping to find creative and compassionate ways of dealing with the child's recalcitrance. And that can be done, but they need support, they need understanding, they need education. And they certainly have the goodwill, but goodwill by itself is just not enough, unfortunately. You have to have some deeper understanding. And if you do, believe me, the whole game changes. I've seen that over and over and over and over again.
You talk about compassionate curiosity. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Let me give you an example. If I said to you, Lucy, why did you do that? How would you respond?
I would be defensive. Yeah, immediately.
What if I said, hey, Lucy, I wonder why you did that.
I'd be open. You're opening
Exactly.
up conversation.
That's the difference.
Yeah.
The question is the same, but the first one is the accusation and an interrogation. The second one is just an exploration. That's all I mean. When we don't understand something, let's be curious, but let's be compassionate about how we conduct that investigation. And so the therapeutic method that I teach, and we have a program called Compassionate Inquiry for therapists, and we've had over 3,000 students in 80 countries, is just that. It's how to conduct an inquiry about anything with a client or with a child, well, actually with adults, compassionately. Because there's a spiritual teacher, a psychologist actually, who said that only when compassion is present will people allow themselves to face the truth. So compassion is really important.
Can patterns heal? Can a child who's been traumatized recover? And can people heal themselves from the symptoms that lead them to behave with attention deficit? How does that happen?
Well, in the case of a child, it's up to the adults to change the environment through their own understanding of the child in a way that will promote healthy development. There's a capacity of the human brain called the neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity means that we can develop new brain circuits in response to new experiences. And I can tell you some very encouraging experiments with animals about that, but also with human beings. So what we're after here is neuroplasticity. And that's a developmental attribute, which once again has to do with the conditions of development. That's for children. So it's up to the schools, the kindergartens, the parents, the daycares, all the institutions and individuals who deal with children to provide those conditions of understanding and compassion. Again, I'm not talking about permissiveness. With adults, it's a bit more difficult because now it's the adult who has to change their own environment in order to promote their own change. But I can tell you, I'm not nearly as impulsive as I used to be. I don't have the same addictive patterns that I used to fall into. I'm writing a new book. I spent 8 hours yesterday sitting at the computer working on the book, and I'll do that again after you and I finish this lovely conversation. So I've changed. My brain has changed. And, I'm not exactly a youngster. I'm 82. So, I tell you, if I can do it, anybody can do it. But it does depend on the right conditions, which means what kind of food are you eating? Do you get out into nature? If you have emotional issues, and I've had plenty of them, do you get therapy for them? Do you deal with them? Are you willing to grow emotionally? If you're in a relationship, are you willing to work on the relationship? Because relationships are a wonderful school for growth if the couple can use it that way. Sometimes medication, which I've sometimes taken, haven't had them for a long time, but when I did, I found them temporarily helpful practices that anybody can do, like breathing techniques, conscious breathing several times a day. Anybody can learn that. It doesn't cost a penny. You can go on the internet and learn some breathing techniques. Physical exercise that's been shown to help the ADD brain. In other words, what I'm saying, there's a lot of things we can do for ourselves. And you know what? I still lose laptops on airplanes and items in hotel rooms. And as I said in an article I wrote recently, I have this special talent that's really enviable. I can sit at my desk and not move and lose something. Most people can't do that, but I'm brilliant at it. You know, I'm always going to be like that. So what?
Do you,
It's just a...
yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was going to ask before, because you may have to go, but I was just going to ask what worries you. We've had figures out just this week on children being given antidepressants. So we've discussed very much about attention deficit disorder, but we have a whole plethora of other neuroses and problems and depression and eating disorders. Huge problem. What do you think, what do you attribute that to, and what worries you most about it?
First of all, let's look at that word depression. It's a good English word. What does it mean to depress something? What does it mean to depress something?
They talk about low mood, and we have record.
I was actually talking about the word depression.
Oh, to push down. Yeah.
Right. Let's talk English then. What is pushed down in depression? Emotions. Now, you've never met a one-day-old child that pushes down their emotions. Want to see raw emotion? Look at a one-day-old or a 2-month-old. So depression then happens in response to the environment. Children push down their feelings when those feelings are not acceptable or understood or validated, seen, heard by the adults. So the rise in depression amongst kids, so the same cause as the rise in ADHD and everything else, the fractured relationship between adults and kids, and the stressed environment in which kids grow up. Then we give them an antidepressant. You know, now I've taken antidepressants, and certainly as a physician, I used to prescribe them. They can help sometimes, or they can't, depending on the individual. But they're not the answer to anything. They provide symptom relief. One thing that just came to my head out of left field, if I may mention. Are you familiar with that wonderful British series, Adolescence?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, if you look at that world, what did you see in that world? Is kids completely cut off from the adults. And trying to get their needs met through each other. They're being frustrated. That film was beautifully done. I don't even know how they did it. It's just one of the best things I've ever seen. But it showed what happens to kids when their attachment bereft.
So your book, Hold On to Your Kids, about how children are more looking to their peers for guidance is where we're going with that. And so we're looking at society today, which is fractured, which is busy, where people are overstretched. But you're saying actually step down and focus for at least some time of the day on children and relate to them and validate them and look at where they're at and honor them.
Well, yes, I couldn't have summed it up better. Do we have time for me to say one more thing?
Yes, please do. Go ahead.
Okay. When you walk on the earth, walk in the streets of London or Bristol or wherever you are, do you have to worry about floating off into space? Do you have to think about how do I keep myself on the ground? Do you?
No.
Why don't you have to do that?
Because we've become used to and acclimatized to gravity, and we know that will just keep walking. Yeah.
Gravity. Gravity is an attachment force that pulls you to the earth and also pulls the earth towards you, right? We don't have to think about it. You just take it for granted. It just works. Nobody has to think about gravity, unless you're going to build an airplane or something, you know? Now, however, what if all of a sudden you were beamed up to the moon, where the moon's gravitational force is 1/6 that of the earth or less? You start floating, wouldn't you? Because that attachment force is not so powerful anymore. You can't take it for granted. So if you're going to be a cosmonaut or an astronaut or any kind of a moonwalker, you'd have to compensate for it by wearing heavier shoes and so on. And, you know, now, what I'm saying is, emotionally speaking, we've landed on the moon. We've lost the gravitational attachment force of attachment in this culture. Now we have to compensate for it. We don't have to think about gravity in the physical sense, but we do have to think about the lost force of gravity in the emotional sense. So you have to become conscious, because we've really landed on the moon. And if we become conscious of attachment again, we can restore those relationships with great difficulty in the face of modern stresses, but at least if we're aware of it, we can start to work with it. That's the message.
Yeah. And it's chicken and egg for you. If we wouldn't be on the phones and on the screens and on the laptops, if we were attaching, rather than this was the beginning. Although, yeah, this rise in smartphone use and disorders in children does seem to be starting at a particular time and a date, but you're saying that just sort of made the problem even worse.
Yes, and by the way, the digital companies, they know how to create products that trigger the brain's addictive circuitry.
Yeah.
By the way, I did something brilliant for myself about 5 weeks ago now. I deleted the Instagram app on my cell phone.
Okay. We need to take a leaf out of that book. Yes.
Because I was just sitting there, you know, even at this age, and, you know, with all the stuff that's going on in my life, it was so easy to get into just scrolling mindlessly. What does that do to my brain and my attention, let alone to my productivity? You know, so there's things we can do.
One last question, because I don't want to keep you too long. We have a proposal in the UK, and Australia's already done it, to ban social media for under 16s. Where are you with that?
I'm all in favor of it. If I was a parent these days, I wouldn't let my kids near a screen for years and years and years and years and years. And I certainly would not allow them in the schools.
Would you not be concerned that they would go on VPNs, that some would have it, some wouldn't, and then when they hit 16, they won't know what to do, and that there are good things about YouTube shorts in chemistry or whatever it is?
Well, if we were to use these devices under the guidance of adults and under the regulation of adults, that's one thing. Now, by the way, do you drink alcohol at all?
I do.
Yeah. Would you give it to a 1-year-old?
No.
Most people will agree that sex is a pretty good thing.
Yeah.
But we don't want to impose it on 3-year-olds. So then, in other words, social media and digital devices should be brought into the picture when the kids are ready to handle it, when they're mature enough for it, under the guidance of adults.
But you wouldn't argue that it's better to make the tech companies be responsible so that it is appropriate, age appropriate, and that, you know, they're clever enough to invent the things. Why should children be expected to reform because tech companies can't behave?
Well, tech companies being responsible is an oxymoron. Capitalist corporations being responsible for human values is an oxymoron. It's like saying military intelligence. It's an oxymoron. And fact is, these companies, they're set up to make a profit. Now, we know what that does. You know, I mean, I read the British Guardian every day, and almost every day there's a new article about climate scientists tearing their hair out because of new evidence showing the deleterious effects of technology and fossil use and so on. Does that make any difference to the corporations? The tobacco companies that for decades denied the health effects or the disease effects of their product, they denied it. The food companies that have been shown to conspire to produce just a very combination of salt, sugar, and fat that's going to make people addicted. That's killing millions of people around the world. So when we talk about corporate responsibility, please.
Dr. Maté, thank you so much for joining us. Today, we've been talking about attention deficit disorder, but also about something much bigger, about childhood, about stress, about the environments we ask children to grow up in, and about what happens when those environments don't meet with the developing brain and what it really needs. Your work challenges us to look beyond labels, beyond symptoms, and to ask not only what is wrong with a child, but what has happened to them and what kind of world are we asking them to live in. You've been listening to Family Talk at Care Visions. Thank you so much for listening.